Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. As we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. We're really excited to have you with us tonight. We have an amazing guest, and it's oh my, oh my, oh my all over the place. But before we bring Mark and Varla in, I want to thank Ken Quiet Hawk for that amazing introduction. You can find him and his wife at nativestorytellers.com. They are amazing people, and they have a gift, and the stories they tell are just taking us back to our roots, and everybody should experience that from time to time. So without further ado, I'm going to pull Mark on here because he's got a fabulous show on tonight. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Barbara. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. Hey, did you have a good weekend?
Had a great weekend. It's we're expecting more snow, but aside from that, it's been great here, and happily the weather hasn't been horrendous. So, there's no great shoveling or anything like that going on. So it's been good all ways round.
Okay, I'm still waiting for the crocuses to pop up.
You have a ways to go for that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to do a quick rant before we bring in our super terrific guest. Did you hear about the results from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation test of citizenship?
No, I did not.
Okay. It was in the local paper, but I guess the press release went out. I didn't know if it appeared in your paper, but there's this senior age group did very well on the history tests. Those 45 and under performed extremely poorly. There's one of the lines from the article from our local writer who summarized the results. He wrote, thinkers at this foundation made an excellent point about why so many people don't know important things about history and citizenship. The teaching of American history has traditionally focused on memorization, dates, names, and events. This poll shows that these methods of learning history have not been effective, the foundation stated in a news release. So I think Nightlight needs to be part of the school's curriculum.
I would agree with you.
Yeah. Mothman and the Chinese in St. Louis. We're covering a little bit of everything, but people keep subscribing to the YouTube channel, so I guess they're agreeing more with us than the these citizenship tests. But anyhow, we're close to approaching the 6-month anniversary of Nightlight Part 2. So
yes.
we, might be somewhere around halfway to Halloween. I don't know. I don't really do math, but we can celebrate the full moon tonight, anyways. But
Absolutely.
we're just getting to our first haunting ghosts creepy show, and this is going to be an important show because we do have a couple more ghost shows booked for March. So to get this new theme for our show kicked off right, we have the Queen of Freakitude with us. Varla Ventura is an international folklore scholar and has been researching ghosts and paranormal activities in San Francisco and now in the northern Midwest. She is the author of Paranormal Parlor, Ghost Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings. My favorite, Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night. Other Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings, and Among the Mermaids. So we're going to be touching on at least 4 of her books tonight. So I just want to welcome Varla. How are you?
Oh, thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you. Hello, Mark. Hello, Barbara. I'm so happy to be here with you on this cold, snowy supermoon night.
Yeah, we're very glad you're here, and I think you're going to be laying the foundations for the other shows we have coming up next month. So I really appreciate that. So let's kind of ease our way into all kinds of creepy stuff for this full moon. Okay, so before Varla enthralls us with her acumen, to quote Dr. Lecter, about Parisian catacombs, haunted hotels, creepy mermaid stories, and my favorite, Claremont. We need to hear about this one shocking paranormal haunting case. It is at Laura Ingells Wilder's house. Okay, what's up with that? Did Nellie's ghost move in? What's going on there?
No, Nellie's still there torturing her with her golden curls. So it's actually the Ingalls Homestead, and I believe it is the one that's in DeSmet. And it's the one that I believe Ma and Pa are both buried in this, on this property. And interestingly enough, you can now go there and camp out on the Ingalls property, and it's privately owned, but they rent covered wagons and things like that you can sleep in, or you can just go kind of wander around the property. But it's a bunch of the family is buried on this site, including Ma and Pa, Mary, Carrie, Grace, but pretty much everyone but Laura and Almanzo, who were buried elsewhere, and they were buried in Missouri. And it is supposed to be pretty common to, hear strange things on that property, to see spirits, and a lot, most commonly are lights, sort of strange little orbs and lights and specters and things like that. So that was a story that I sort of discovered after moving to the prairie, moving to the Midwest, and looking into some of the local hauntings. And actually, I stumbled upon that reading something about Laura Ingells Wilder's life. So I wasn't necessarily looking to see if there was haunting in that area. I just happened to be reading something about her, and then, fell down the rabbit hole of trying to track where the homestead was and could you go there, and found out you could camp there. And then that led me to a number of different accounts of people, having these paranormal experiences. I mean, I personally, what I imagine is that you would hear Pa's fiddle. That's what I imagine. You would just hear like the sound of, one of the songs just on the distance. You'd wake up and leap out of your covered wagon and see what you could see. I mean, if we're gonna paint the romantic tale, we're gonna go all the way. We're gonna have Pa's fiddle playing in the background, and but no, a number of people have reported sightings, and there is a Ingalls cemetery on the property.
Okay, that case study is intriguing. It's okay. It's really different from let's just say the Parisian catacombs that Jeff told you about. Mm-hmm. But it's that's one of the interesting things about these ghost stories. That one caught me by surprise. And then you had the sample of was it the Mary Lake School for Girls? It's one of those kind of both of them are cases where it doesn't seem like anything unusual happened there. Is it just their wanting to be alive, keeping them at these locations? Like the School for Girls seemed like it was kind of a normal turn of the century Victorian type school, and nothing unusual happened there. I just wonder why something is, people are hearing Pa's fiddle or, something like that.
Well, one thing I often think of in terms of haunting is that we don't, so you don't know, you might know someone really well. You might have a best friend or a neighbor that you're very close with or a relative, but you don't actually, and you know a lot of the inner workings of their life, but you don't actually know what is happening in their life 24 hours a day. So sometimes I think of haunting as like there's no noted thing in history. There was no, recorded suicide on this site. There was no known, accident or something that might have what we would think of and what we often read about in the best of horror stories, like the trigger event that caused this haunting. Now, while I do think that there's a connection between trauma and haunting or people, having paranormal experiences, there can be a connection between that. I kind of think of it in a way that those are just the things we don't know about. But of all the things you think of, the inner workings of, the day in, day out, take the girls' school, for example. So we don't have any records of people saying, oh, there was torture here, or, I was really depressed, or I was really sad, or I wanted to stay here and my parents made me leave, or any of these kinds of things. But I also think that we don't know necessarily why places are haunted. We like to speculate that it has something to do with people not being able to move on or let go. But we also have experiences where it's something it's a protective spirit, or it might just be happenstance, and it could be something that moves around and there's a lot of different places, but you just happen to be in that place when you pick up what it is. So it's just such a vast, there's a lot of variety. So I guess I think, some places are certainly hotbeds, just like we have ley lines and places that have more magical energy. We're going to have some places that might have an increase in hauntings. But anyone, and I'm sure you can attest to this yourself, it's very hard to walk into a situation and say, all right, I'm going to see a ghost here. That's what's going to happen today. I'm going to sit here until I see it goes. It just doesn't always work that way. It has a lot more to do with time and place and, kind of to your passing with this other message, whether it's from a ghost, an entity, a memory of a house, whatever it is. And we don't really know, right? Like, we don't really know if it's like the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland where the ghosts are all just waltzing about and we can only see them as we go by for a glimpse, but they're just doing their same thing on repeat. We don't know if it's that all the time around us and we only see it sometimes, or if there are just moments when both kind of worlds collide and it's like, there's suddenly a peephole that you can look through. And there's obviously a lot of debate about that and volumes of literature and, nonfiction, just people writing about their experiences and their thoughts and philosophy on these kinds of things. But probably the most intriguing thing about it is that we don't know. And that is why we keep looking. Because we know there's something, but we don't know what it is, right?
Right. I don't have an explanation either. It's, like I said, that little case study you presented really caught me by surprise. And I don't have an explanation for it. Ghost isn't my primary area of expertise. I think it's interesting. I just don't know a whole lot about it. I just wanted to contrast that example in the Mary Lake Girls School with some of the other ones we'll get into, because those are maybe like the haunted hotels and hospitals is more probably definitive study that most people could relate to. I just wonder more about the good times, and so I just and why people might just be stuck in a loop there where so many nice things happened. I don't know. I just want to throw that out.
Yeah. I mean, that's. I think. Well, I guess my point was sort of that, maybe we don't know all the things that took place. We only have a small portion of, our history written down. And so much of it is lost with generations dying or stories not being retold. And so we don't know, maybe there was trauma on that land. Maybe there was some kind of other history to it that we just don't know about. And so that could also be a reason that it's a place that the veil is thin and these ghosts can all dance about. I think that's definitely worth, that's worth contemplating for sure.
Oh, yeah. No, you are doing an excellent job of getting us to think about things like that. And, we could segue into an autobiographical tale in the early stages of paranormal parlor, where you have this toothbrush story. What's
the curious case of the haunted toothbrush? That's what I like to call it. Yeah, that was. So I had been living in a place I'd been living in this sort of attic apartment in an old Victorian in San Francisco, and I had been living there for a number of years. I think when that story took place, I had already been in that place 10 or 15 years. Anyone who's from San Francisco understands this. There was a certain point when you just couldn't move. You didn't move, and if you ever wanted to and you missed your chance, you had to stay in whatever place you had, because the rents went up so quickly that unless your salary went up along with it, which of course if you're an artist or a writer, it did not. So it was fine. I loved it. It was a creaky, old, haunted, kind of beautiful Victorian in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in San Francisco. So lots of history there. Just a lot of there's just a lot going on there, for better or for worse. So I was in this apartment, and I had actually kind of had an extra room open up in the apartment, and I had my nieces and my sister and my mom came down with my two nieces and my nephew. And they were all pretty little then. I think my nephew, he's the oldest, so he was maybe 10 or 11, 3 little kids. And I didn't have children of my own at that point. And so it was really kind of I think they were the first group of kids to be in that apartment overnight since I had been living there. They had all come to stay, but I was kind of in the front apartment, which was this small place. And then the back of the house opened up, and I moved into that. And in that, there was an extra room, and that's the room that my niece was staying in that night. And so what had happened is the kids, I had had quite a few experiences in the front room. At one point, this was all one huge flat, one big, beautiful flat. But by the time, I lived there, it was divided up. So I had a bunch of experiences when I lived in the front flat, like things pressing down on my bed and, strange noises at night. And, of course, always when you're alone, these things happen. Taps in the bathroom, some of which you can chalk up to it being an old Victorian in a noisy neighborhood, and some of which you just can't quite explain away. So I was in the back apartment, and I had just moved there, so now I had more space, and I said, why don't you guys come down and stay for a few days, and we'll do some San Francisco stuff with the kids. So we put the kids up in one of the bedrooms, and they had these little electric toothbrushes, and, very diligently, cutely brushing their teeth as they were supposed to, and then they lined their little toothbrushes up on my sink in the bathroom. And then, time passed, evening passes, everybody settled down for bed, and it's about, 3 in the morning, and I hear this noise. I hear this buzzing noise, and I'm thinking, what is that? Why is there a buzzing noise? My first thought was going to wake the kids up or something. And then I hear it stop. I was like, okay, I drift back to sleep. I hear it again. And I can hear that my niece has gotten up, and then it stops. And then a little while later, it started again. And then I hear, so then at that point I get up, and my niece is coming back from the kitchen, which is at the other end of the house. And by then, her mom and grandma were all up, kind of trying to figure out what's going on. Now it's probably 5 or 6 in the morning, I think, or it hadn't quite gotten light yet. And I was like, what's happening? And she said, well, my toothbrush kept going off. My electric toothbrush kept going off, and I got up twice and turned it off. Such a brave girl, not afraid at all. It was a weird toothbrush going off in the night. And the third time, I just got tired of it, so I brought it into the other room, and I just put it on the windowsill, so even if it went off again, I wouldn't hear it. So she just stuck it in the other room. So we thought, well, that's kind of a very strange occurrence that happened multiple times. Instead of asking my sister, has it ever happened before? Is the battery low? So she takes it home. It doesn't do it at all once they get home. Not again. It doesn't need to replace the battery for, a good year on that thing or however long, it's kind of a, what the heck, what happened there? And I always have tended to believe children when they tell me that things or experience things, because I, as a child, would experience or sense things, and I had my mom and some of her, witchy friends, they always just went with it. They never made me feel like I was making things up. Even if it was the leprechaun I saw down by the creek, it wasn't like, oh no, there's no, now it's like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. What do they look like? So fast forward maybe another 2 or 3 months, and other things start happening in that same room. And we decide that we're going to turn that room into, so then it turns out that I am expecting my son, which, of course, I didn't know he was a son at the time. So we're having a baby. I get some people to come over and help me kind of move some stuff around, and this room needs to be repainted. But in the process, we pull back some of the paper. Totally probably shouldn't be doing this, lead paint exposure in pregnancy and all that stuff. But we do it anyway. And when we pull it back, we find this beautiful piece of like a 1920s, 1930s print circus wallpaper. And I think it was a nursery. I think it was a child's room at one time. And so from that point on and going forward, as I brought my baby home and lived in the house a little more, and I actually was writing, I think I was writing the Banshee book right around this time, more and more activity started taking place. I saw things hovering above the crib. I heard toys going off in the other room, a lot of different. I always felt that the paranormal activity kicked up a notch once there were children around, which led me to think that it could be the ghost of a child, or my mom swore that she felt the presence of a woman who was more like a child minder, like a nanny or something like that, so was always watching the children. And it all kind of started with that haunted toothbrush. Like I said, I'd had some experiences in the front flat, and a few things had happened that, I kind of shrugged off. Even those of us who are supernaturalists don't believe everything that happens to us, right? So I shrugged a few things off, and then after that, things really, I kind of started documenting them a little more. And then, as you pointed out, Mark, in the my latest book, Paranormal Parlor, I actually put in a lot of my own experiences, kind of starting with those things that were happening around the kids, and then as I wrote in the book, I realized, depending on what chapter I was working on and what story someone had shared with me, that I would kind of sprinkle in my own experiences. But it did all kind of start with the toothbrush. The kids, they were the trigger. So now my niece and I, we call it the curious case of the haunted toothbrush.
Do you feel like, you mentioned some of your family, does the do you feel like the ability to sense paranormal presence does run in families, or is it more like a mother and daughter type thing? What do you think of that subject? Are some people more susceptible to than others?
I do think that it's often passed down from generation to generation. I do think that even without the nurture aspect of it, you'll have people who later in life, their moms will admit to them that they also had this experience in that house, but they never wanted to say anything because they didn't want to scare the kid. Or something like that. But I do think it's very, very common to find out that a family member, or to know that you have a family member. Now, I don't think everyone can do it, and I don't think everyone in a family necessarily is open to it. But I also think you don't always have to be open to it for it to happen. Sometimes it just happens. And that is part of, what the Irish would call the second sight, right? That's what allows you to see fairies at night and, sort of read the warning signs from the mermaids and all these kinds of things. It all kind of blends together. So I do think there is some nurture to it, in that for myself, whatever innate abilities I had were nurtured from a young age, instead of being, I wasn't made to sit up straight in a church pew and told that that was all impossible. I was, pointed in the direction of, go and lucid dream, or things like that. So I definitely was lucky in that I didn't. I had sort of an education, sort of an occult education at a young age, but I do think that that's something that can be inherited. And in fact, that's sort of, if you don't want to segue this quickly into banshees, I understand, but it's totally the whole deal with Irish banshees is that for anyone who doesn't know exactly what a banshee is, it's a warning, basically kind of a wailing woman that is used as a warning. The sound or the seeing a banshee can indicate grave illness or death, usually of a family member. And it was believed that the banshees and the ability to see the banshees were, and that's an area that's up for debate, is it the ability to see them, or did the banshees actually follow the family? As some accounts say that the banshees were attached to some of the original king clans of Ireland, and that, everyone sort of descended, and certain castles are known to have certain ghosts, and that these would attach themselves to families, where traditionally the family would stay generation after generation after generation in the same place, or the same property or castle or estate. But it could also be that the ability to actually sense and see those things was what was inherited, and that is why the ghost stuck with that family, or in this case, the banshee. Banshees being unique because they are not exactly a ghost. They're more of the fairy kingdom, but they are certainly equated with a lot of warning ghosts that we see around the world. So there are kind of similarities with that ominous appearance of the lady in white who tells you that, the little boy down the lane isn't going to make it, or whatever it ends up being.
That's what you just mentioned is a subject that may be coming up in a couple weeks when we do a case study from the Isle of Man, and it's roughly in that area, and it's just something I have to keep in mind. It's just your information is very, very interesting. Okay, now that we have moved over into banshees, werewolves, and vampires, you have an interesting story by William Butler Yeats in your Banshees book, and he makes appearances, a couple appearances in the Mermaid book, and throughout all of your the cullings of all these fantastic authors over the years, like Sir Walter Scott, these very notable literary names all had an interest in these kind of paranormal topics, whether they're mermaids or the banshees. These topics just never seem to have ever died out. They continue to capture people's imaginations. Or do some of these writers really do think that they're real?
You have a natural affinity of people who are interested in something like fairy and folklore, and like artists and writers who have a natural kind of
angels
tendency to and just to imagine things beyond the tangible that you can see in front of you. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that someone like William Butler Yeats, who was traveling around gathering all these folk tales and had this intense interest in the folk stories of Ireland, but also he was a very spiritualist person, very interested in the occult, astrology, all these kinds of topics that tend to kind of put somebody in the frame of mind of the belief in another realm that we can't see. And I think poets especially are connected to that realm. They have an ability to invoke something with almost no words. They can invoke feeling and emotion, and that's its own kind of magic. So I think that there's this natural connection between the literary arts and the study of ghosts. And you actually have a number of writers who were perhaps known for other things who dabbled in ghost stories, and or people who were known as writers but not necessarily as ghost writers, who everybody at one point, especially during the sort of the late Victorian turn of the century era, when seances and things like that were becoming much more commonplace, I think you had everybody tried their hand at a little ghost story. I mean, it's kind of like English literature 101. So, well, okay, now today we're going to study the ghost story, and we're going to kind of dabble into this world of, being haunted or the unknown. So I think you do have a natural connection with a lot of the great writers of that time, and ghosts and fairies. And in fact, I think you could ask many writers today, they all probably have some kind of ritual, and they might not admit it, but there's probably something that they pay homage to when they, start a new work or finish a new work or are stuck. Everybody's got their kind of rituals to get over their writer's block, and it doesn't hurt to have some little wee folk on your side in a situation like that.
Those examples you gave from the Victorian era, like Charles Dickens and the Christmas Carol, and the later Victorian classic Turn of the Screw, are just fantastic examples of the development of that genre. And throughout canon, and sticking in the Banshees book, you do have the Dracula's guest, and we could spend a little bit of time on that one. There's a connecting theme with some that you develop, or at least note in some of the works, are these cold spots. I thought that was really interesting, and we have one in the basement that seems to be there from time to time. But you mentioned the cold spot in the Paranormal Parlor book, and then in the Dracula's Guest. It's what the story said in like May, and the protagonist of the story ends up being stuck in a snowstorm. And that's like a variation of a cold spot. How does that fit into?
Yeah.
But you keep. It is a theme that you develop throughout some of your writings. What's the importance of this phenomenon?
Boy, you really actually read everything. I'm like, wow. I think you might be the first person to ever notice that. Yeah, well, I was raised to trust my, for a lack of a better way to describe it, just to trust my witchy instincts. And so what does that mean? Ma, I have no idea what that means. You're 10 years old, so you got to kind of trust that you can sense these things. And one of the ways that my mom kind of taught me to understand if there might be a spirit or some kind of, it was actually really a coping tool, because I would see things and I would be unsure, or I would be, it's just like, okay, well, in order to keep you from being afraid, I'm going to give you some tools that will give you the power to understand what's going on, at least to a certain degree. And one of those things was to, feel things. It's like, okay, is it hot? Is it cold? Can you feel the cold spot? Now, we have heard since time immemorial that a good ghost story sends shivers down your spine, that there's this natural response that we have to this sort of chill. And I think it really relates to, and why we think that it is connected with ghosts specifically, is that I do think that it relates to death and the fact that time, your body goes cold. It literally goes cold. And that is such a fascination to us that can be, because until you have seen it or felt it, experienced it, it's very hard to really understand that. And, apart from people who've had near-death experiences, most of us are not going to know what death feels like until we're dead. And then it'll be up to, everybody else to try and figure out what that feels like. And it's just this sort of obsession that we have. And I think that that's why, again and again, we have themes that involve, something very, very cold and sort of like this impression that the other side is cold, because we imagine people cold in their graves. The moonlight is cold, a snowy night is cold, and that is somehow spookier. And I think that also has to do with the time of year that we associate with a lot of the, the veil becoming the thinnest, ghosts kind of gallivanting about more freely when there's more darkness and therefore less sunlight and therefore less warmth. And that is, during the, from basically Halloween through, well, now really it's still pretty cold. And you can see there's a little change in the light at night, but mostly we have these long winter's night. Now, that being said, there are plenty of accounts of, ghosts in steamy, hot jungles, of course, and there are plenty of people who live in climates that don't have, a cold snap of a New England evening. But I think that even within that, you can sense this kind of cold spot. It's like a harbinger. It's its own kind of it's its own banshee, I guess, to say like, oh, death is nigh, something is off here, and you can tell because it's a different temperature than your own body. I think that's probably why it works its way into so many different stories and themes, and I do think it's a fundamental theme in a classic ghost story as well.
Okay. And I think the sample that you found of Bram Stoker's Dracula's Guest, I've read Dracula, but that's really the only thing I've read of his, other than this sample and what you mentioned, had a quotation from one of his shorter works with rats in the title.
Oh, The Burial of Rats. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So
terrifying. Terrifying. That's a short story. Yeah.
Okay. Where does this Dracula's Guest come from? Because it seems like such a really good example of all these different motifs that you've been discussing. So, well, there's kind of a cool backstory between, and I also, up until, when did I write this book? Like 2000, let me look at the copyright page, 2013. So I was writing it in 2012, sorry. So up until that point, I actually had not read anything else by Bram Stoker other than Dracula, which I had read, 10, 20 times. And I happened upon this collection that his widow published after his death. And I think he died, so it was published in 1914. So I think he died in 1912 or 1913. I can't remember off the top of my head. And he had this collection of short stories that he did not think were very good and did not think they were fit for publication. And then he wrote Dracula. Dracula was published. And then he really kind of shoved them away, because I think that's something that can happen to certain writers. You have this monumental work and it's this monumental success, and then you kind of don't know what to do next because you feel all of this pressure externally and internally. So anyway, she read them. They were wonderful. I believe she had read them before, and he just did not think they were up to snuff. And she even has this wonderful quote in the introduction to the collection saying, she says, had my husband lived longer, he might have seen fit to revise this work, which is mainly from the earlier years of his strenuous life. But as fate has entrusted me to the issuing of it, I consider it fitting and proper to let it go forth practically as it was left by him. And they maybe weren't as refined as he would have liked, but this story, The Burial of Rats, is totally terrifying. It's this kind of, I think it's set in Paris, kind of in a suburb, and this soldier goes wandering through these kind of outer barrios of Paris at the time. This was the late 1800s, and it's just a slum, and there's rats everywhere. And it just kind of becomes this descent into madness as he is wandering through these garbage-strewn outer regions of Paris, trying to get back to the center and trying to kind of escape from these rats that are following him everywhere. And it's really quite terrifying. And totally not something I completely off my radar. And then this was another story, Dracula's Guest, and it's just the complete perfect. I think it actually might have even been written before he really developed Dracula as a novel.
And it's got everything perfect you could ever want in a setting. First of all, it's Walpurgis Nacht, so it is the witch's night. You are picture it, okay, you're traveling by carriage on this lonesome this lonesome road, and the wheel breaks and the carriage breaks down, and a storm is coming. And where can you possibly take refuge? There's only one place, and it's the cemetery, and it's one of the the crypts in the cemetery. It's the only place to shelter out the storm. And it's like, do you even need to know more than that? You're pretty much like you're in the absolute ultimate horror setting. And it's just of course it's beautifully written because he was an amazing writer, and it kind of foretells some of the, I don't know if you remember Dracula, but Dracula is written primarily in letter form, going back and forth between, So this is not in letter form. This is kind of, stuck in this place, and then he finds this letter. And then it breaks down, and then he attempts to walk, and then the storm hits, and then he has to go and take shelter in this tomb where he finds this letter. So it's really quite a beautiful story, and just a little bit lesser known than most of his other works. But it's great because it does. I love finding things. Sometimes there are things that aren't as popular by popular writers, and you can kind of see why. Maybe they weren't fully developed as writers yet, or they had a bad editor or something. But somebody like Bram Stoker, who is so incredibly talented, and that's the reason his work endures so much. It's not because he got lucky and somebody made a movie of it. It's because the work itself was so good that it was able to endure and go for generations and generations. We've read this and we've imagined that this Vlad Dracula is a real person. But it's so fun when you find an old, a more obscure story by somebody that you enjoy their writing, and then you read it and it just reminds you of what a good writer they are, and how, kind of brings you back to that first time you read that of theirs.
Varla, when you're just talking about, finding an excellent manuscript like this Dracula's Guest. I don't know. It could have been almost like a prequel or some chapter that is really well done. It just didn't fit because it's not like in like Lucy's letters from Dracula. Where are you going for your sources to find this sample from Bram Stoker? Of course we have to get into one of my favorite ones authors I like talking about is T. Crofton Croker. It's like how do you find these really well known, or they're great stories, but just over time some of these authors don't have the name recognition, but they have wonderful stories. Do you have an extensive library? Or
I have an incredibly extensive library. I am a complete book hoarder. I have so many books, and this.
Join the club.
And I don't care. I just want more books. I just actually when I get around books, I get that. It's almost like a drug addict or something. I just sort of start feeling really greedy. I have this inner greed where I just want them all. And there's a bookstore I discovered in a little town not far from where I live that had, when I was writing Paranormal Parlor, one of the authors that I've always really enjoyed over the years is Elliot O'Donnell, and he has written about banshees. I believe he wrote about werewolves to a certain extent. Not a lot about mermaids, but he just a bunch about fairies, tons of ghost stuff, and he's just sort of one of those names that just keeps popping up in as I'm reading him. So I found an old volume of some of his work at this bookstore, like a real old book, and it wasn't even that expensive. And I was like, oh my God, this is like Elliot O'Donnell's Book of Ghosts. And, it wasn't even behind a locked cupboard or anything. I couldn't believe it. So I got that, and in that I found a couple of stories that I had never read before. So I would say that usually the way that I start, depending on whatever the topic is, so let's say, I want to write about banshees. Well, banshees, they're not a lot of books that are just say, okay, this is about banshees. So I knew the banshee stories that I knew were, for example, William Butler Yeats wrote about banshees, and he wrote about changelings. And I knew this because I had this massive volume from when I was a kid of his fairy and folk tales. So I had a copy of that. And you'll find, and anyone who has access to any of these old books that perhaps they read when they were, much, much younger, but they've held on to them, or you sneak back into your parents' library and you find, oh, I remember this. When you revisit those books, you will find, okay, you're going into it because you want to read this changeling story, but then you find that there's a table of contents, and you're looking at table of contents, and there's, 10 other authors that, okay, I remember that story, let me research that author. And I started to find very quickly, because I have a penchant for that sort of, late sort of Victorian era fairy and folklore and ghost stories, turn of the century ghost stories, that's kind of the area that I just gravitate toward in this kind of literature and folklore. I love it all, but that's just where I continue to go back to again and again, especially with a lot of the old Irish stories. And you find that, go back and read the introduction. And in the introduction, not the modern day introduction, which can sometimes be insightful and sometimes just be like total blowhardery, you'll find in the original author's introduction the mention, and often only by initials, of other writers. And you can start to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. So once I am able to, I'll make like a list of like books that I want to read, or that I want to research and see if they exist. And I use a combination of, when I lived in San Francisco, the San Francisco Public Library had this amazing archive of old books that you couldn't actually check them out. They had all these old reference books and stuff. You couldn't actually check them out, but you could go there and you could sit there, from opening till closing, and, get everything you wanted out of these books and take notes, or make notes of books you wanted to look for. That was a big resource for me. And then somebody turned me on to Gutenberg, which is a really cool, Gutenberg.org, which is a really cool resource. And that is like facsimile scans of all of these old books that are in the public domain. And it's this kind of this funky looking site when you go to it, but just, trust me, go to the search bar and type in a word. So you could go to that search bar and you could type in banshee, or you could type in, angel, or whatever you wanted to type in. I was usually typing in ghost, or you have to be careful. Fairy doesn't really work very well because there are so many things dubbed fairy tales that weren't the kind of things that I was looking for. But that is a way to, one, read very obscure material that might not exist at your public library or on your own bookshelf, and to, again, compile another wish list of, okay, let me see, because it's not everything. It's not everything by any given author. It's all run by volunteers, and you got it, so it's this public project. But that can be a great resource to kind of find obscure things, or see who else was writing about a topic, or just, just for fun, type in a word that you're researching and see. But it's a rabbit hole, because there's a lot of stuff that's going to lead you in the wrong direction. You'll be going down a hole that you didn't, you're just falling, reading something totally fascinating that has nothing to do with the topic you were actually researching. And yet you can't stop. So it is like the internet. It is kind of, you have to just shut it down sometimes, which is why I like to rely heavily on books for my research, because it allows me time to think my own thoughts in response to what I read. And energetically, I don't always have that with the, computer. It's sort of more like glaring at me out of the corner of the room, and the book is welcoming me. Come, stay with us. So I just follow those little Easter eggs all around, and over time have kind of gotten a list of authors that I look for, and am constantly learning about new authors as well, and have found several names and read excerpts from like Gutenberg that I was not able to find a lot of information out about the people, and so those are always kind of in the back of my, in the back of the notebook. It's like, look, if you ever find anything by this or mention of this person, because people wrote under pseudonyms. So that makes it even more cloak and veil, because now you have people who are being thanked under a name that they didn't even write under because they were known by this other name. And so it kind of just sort of adds to the whole, it's like an escape room that you can't and don't want to escape from.
It's and what you're saying about collecting books, I think the people around Barbara and me keep wanting us to join a 12-step program, and we were.
I just got rid of 500 books.
Wow. Was that hard?
That was after 1,000.
Oh.
No,
okay.
I had already read them.
Oh, so I have this thing where I can't even, of all of the books that I have, it's like, I want to have a little free library in my yard. And I was like, but what am I going to put in it? Because, for every 10 books, I have one. Now, there are some that I wouldn't keep. But I did actually at one point, when I was really young, I lost a lot of books and papers that were really important to me. And I think because of that, I've always kind of, overcompensated by hoarding old dusty books. So there you have it.
Well, I just kind of figured, it's good to pass them on so other people can read them too.
Yeah. Yes. That's true.
And since we are speaking about books, we might as well give your publisher a little plug as we just pass the halfway point of the show.
Yeah, my publisher, Wiser Books, wonderful publisher, wonderful to work with, and publisher of many fabulous authors. And all of my books you can find at varlaventura.net. You can find them, wherever books are sold. They're pretty much all in print. And you can also find them at wiserbooks.com, of course. Type in Varla Ventura and you'll find them. But I welcome also, correspondence. I believe you can just email me through the website or contact me through Facebook if people have stories that they want to share, or if they have, favorite stories that they would like to, maybe an old horror story that's your favorite. I always love when people share that information because it seems that I've never gotten to. Every time my book's about to go to print, I learn something that would have been so perfect in that book. So I know enough to know that I just really scratch the surface when it comes to, things of the folkloric nature for sure. So I love when people tell me, oh, have you read this or anything like that. So, yeah.
Well, and you do have an interview with Jeff Bellinger on his
he interviewed me on Ghost Village. Yeah. Oh, yeah, right. Oh,
the Paris
yes.
Catacombs.
Yes. So one thing that I did with this book, Paranormal Parlor, I contacted some people that I had, been befriended over the years just through writing or that I had always wanted to work with but hadn't had any way to make that happen. And Jeff was one of them. I've had correspondence with him for years but never really found a way that we would be working together. And I asked him if he would mind telling me a ghost story. So what I did with the Paranormal Parlor kind of started out, its core was to kind of explore the spiritualist movement, which took place in the United States especially, and other parts of the world, in England and parts of Europe, but especially in the United States, it kind of kicked off around 1840 and tapered off around 1920, 1930, and was really at its heyday post-Civil War and late Victorian era. And just really kind of, that's when everyday people were very interested in what we would think of as the occult, seances and things of that nature. So that was kind of the core. That's what the Paranormal Parlor is. That's the step into the, Victorian parlor and put your hands upon the planchette and we'll see what the spirit world has to tell us. And kind of the idea is that not just that you could contact the other side, but that the other side had messages for us. That was sort of the fundamental difference between spiritualism and some of the previous, scrying and different ways of contacting the other side or the gods or the dead. So anyway, I had been interested in that topic and sort of especially how it related to women and how women sort of found the means to communicate and break out of the confines of Victorian society by becoming poets and, stage performers and professional mediums and things like that, were basically, industries that were not open to them before. You had very few choices. You could, marry someone who was of, wealth, or you would marry low, or you became a servant, or you became a prostitute. You didn't have, a ton of options as a woman. So anyway, that was I started working on that, and as I was doing that, I started thinking about the idea of people having their own experiences, and at what point do you go from researcher to, skeptic to, a believer, and how does someone go, how does that happen for people? And I also have always been fascinated with ghost stories. So I'm collecting ghost stories that I love, and then I'm writing my own ghost stories. And so then I reached out to a few people and said, would you mind contributing a ghost story? And by and large, of all the stories that I got, almost everyone said yes. They all sent these wonderful stories. And actually I interviewed them over the phone and had them tell me the story. I wrote the story down. I wrote it up. I sent it back to them, and I said, did I even get this right? And then they could make corrections or whatever. And the reason I did that is because I actually really wanted to have that experience of being told that story firsthand. I knew that all these people could write, but I wanted to hear them tell me the story, and they were all incredible storytellers. And just to be totally selfish, I wanted that experience. I wanted Jeff to tell me his story over the phone and to hear his voice in my ear telling me, the setting and really taking me, because I knew I would really get the story then. And what was really cool is that there ended up being this theme where, one, the stories fit in really nicely with the chapters that I had already begun in different ways. I originally thought they were all going to go in one chapter, and they ended up going throughout the book because some of them matched other things. And two, by and large, people told me about their first paranormal experience. And I thought that was real cool, too, because that fed back into the idea of what is our turning point, where we go from skeptic / researcher to believer, to understand, to be able to understand. And with Jeff, he told me the story of the first real and true paranormal experience that he had had. And what was great is it takes place in the Parisian catacombs, and I have been in those catacombs. So as he was telling me the story, I knew exactly what he was talking about. It's kind of hard to find, and you kind of need to ask around, and then there's just this little sign on the street, and you go in this, obscure little door, and then the next thing you know, you're walking through a hallway, and it's lined with skulls. I mean, it's quite intense. You see pictures of it, but then when you're in there, and I don't want to give the whole story away, but he had this really incredible experience of, it's kind of the first time he's wandering through these catacombs, and he saw a ghost down there. And that was the first time that he knew definitively that he had seen a ghost, and there was no way to explain it, and that he had already been a paranormal researcher for a number of years. He had started the website Ghost Village, which he still runs today. That was kind of his turning point from being on one side of it to crossing over. And just going back to Elliot O'Donnell, who was someone that I mentioned earlier, one thing that I loved about him is that so many of those Victorian era authors they wrote with their own sort of agenda, and often that was a Christian agenda. And so everything was sort of tinged with sin, that they were witnessing and what they were hearing, what they were telling you about, you mustn't do yourself because it's a sin. And also tinged with the idea that these were foolish tales of the uneducated peasantry. But Elliot O'Donnell, he had paranormal experiences since he was a kid, and he believed in ghosts. He was not just a bystander reporting on things that other people said. He believed it, and he took a totally different approach to it. And I think it's very evident in his writing, even compared to someone like William Butler Yeats, who had an interest in it, but he still has a little tinge of, there's a little snobbery in a lot of the things that he's written. And I don't detect that in Elliot O'Donnell's, because I think that Elliot believed what people were telling him more than some of the other story gatherers believed. And I don't even remember what you asked now.
I don't
You're
either.
talking about Jeff, the
Jeff's
catacombs
trip.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's close enough. We haven't really touched on Among the Mermaids, and we need to delve into that as well. Mermaids are usually, the typical image of them is, like along the rugged Irish coast, or I guess a Lorelei is kind of like a mermaid, and she'd be in the Rhine River, or something like with the pirates in the on the high seas going towards some tropical island. Those are the most frequent images of where the mermaids would be seen. But you have a really interesting tale set in downtown Baltimore. Like that's through a little curve. Yeah, you through a little curve. Yeah, the Mermaid of Druid Lake.
Oh yeah, the Mermaid of Druid Lake. So that's a mermaid that's basically right in a town fountain, or like it's a public park, and it's a little sort of pond in the middle of the park. And it's a hilarious story because basically it involves like taking this mermaid for a joyride. But you can't take a mermaid for a joyride in a regular car, right? Because she's a mermaid. So you have to find a glass. You have to sort of fashion a glass, giant jar on the back of your tank on the back of your car in order to throw the mermaid in and take her for a ride. And it's just this kind of classic story of this, this guy goes by the lake and then he keeps returning and then he keeps returning, but it's not on some remote stretch of deserted island. It's right there in the middle of the city, and he keeps returning and finds this I think he finally convinces her to come with him on this ride. He says, well, I can't. So he hooks up this, and it's just this ridiculous description because I think it was probably written in like 1919 or something like that. And so the car is just, you can just imagine one of those like Ford Model Ts with a big glass tank on the back, and the guy tosses the mermaid in, and they go for a ride. Of course, it doesn't really go well, and it's fine for the mermaid, but it doesn't go great for the guy. He didn't impress her.
Okay, but it just shows the diversity of settings, where authors want to put their mermaid stories. I really enjoyed that one, and I think since we're talking about mermaids, do you think it's time to get into the really creepy mermaid story, The Soul Cages?
Yeah, you asked before about just sort of how I find these, what I use as my sources and things like that. And Crofton Croker wrote this, Thomas Crofton Croker wrote this story, The Soul Cages, and I read it when I was in probably 3rd or 4th grade. It was in a collection of, one of those big primers of stories that you had to read for English. And I remember reading it, and I could never shake it. There was something so disturbing about it to me that when I kind of was talking about the publisher about doing like to do the mermaid, they said, well, like what do you mean, like what's an example, and because I said, well, I want it to be a combination, because with mermaids especially you have to have some of those classic tales, tales, some of those classic stories about mermaids that
Hans Christian Andersen
in literature. Yeah, Hans Christian Andersen. And so the Soul Cages disturbed me to the point that I never forgot it. So then there I am sitting with this publisher asking this question, and I'm like, it just pops, it's like, well, right off the top of my head, I think of this story by T. Crofton Croker, in which he takes a man, the king of the Marrow, takes this man down into the water, and he actually doesn't, unlike a lot of the other stories, he doesn't like drown him. He doesn't pull him under. He brings him under, but somehow he's able to sort of enchant him so that he can just witness what's going on under the sea. And that is where he finds these soul cages. And these soul cages are lobster traps, which are basically just crates, right? And they're all at the bottom of the sea, and they're all closed up. And he says, well, what are those? Well, those are soul cages. Well, what's a soul cage? Well, that's where, if somebody drowns at sea, before their soul drifts off, I go and I capture them and I keep them here in the sea. So now this guy Jack is like friends with this king of the marrow, but all the while he's trying to scheme on how he can open up all of these soul cages without this Merrow like trying to get him and drown him at the same time. And there's definitely a little Christian overlay there of the souls needing to be released up into the air. But what's happening there also is the story of the idea that mermaids were psychopomps in a way. So the psychopomp is a spirit or an otherworldly creature, a magical being that actually helps people transition from life into the next life, from life into death. So whether it is the person who rows the boat across the river Styx, or it's a mermaid, or can be other things. So thinking of the mermaids as psychopomps, so I started thinking of how this guy is keeping the soul cages, and he's keeping these the souls of these lost sailors, essentially. And there was kind of an ongoing theme with that, because then I interviewed some people who had lived at sea for many years and would say that, yes, mermaids can be enchanting, and it can be something that people feared, but it also, they had known fishermen who had been guided properly back to shore thanks to the call of the mermaid, that the mermaid kept them away from the rocks and actually helped them. And there are many cultures that leave offerings for mermaids, especially island cultures. They leave offerings. They respect the mermaids because the mermaids protect them. So there's kind of this vast realm with the mermaids. But with Teacroft and Croker, he had an even creepier story, which I included in the book as well, and that is Florrie Cotillion's funeral. And that is a beautiful, beautiful story in which, a young man is down on the Irish coast, and he may or may not have a fairly decent-sized bottle of whiskey with him as he's sitting, kind of hiding out amongst the rocks on the side of the sea, drinking and looking out at the water. And he sees someone had died in the village, Florrie Cotillion. And Florrie Cotillion had always been rumored to be something a little not quite human about her. There's rumors going back that she had doings with a Merrow or some a couple generations back. So her casket is carried down onto the sea and onto the beach. And I think it had been there. It was her funeral, so it had been there, and the idea was that the waves would lap it up, or they would send it out to sea the next day. And he's sitting there drinking alongside not far from, just out of sight from anyone else, but right pretty close to the casket, and these sort of white beings kind of rise up out of the sea and surround the casket and hoist it up and take it out to sea with them. And it's this really haunting and beautiful, dark Irish night, just a bit of moonlight and these entities and a bottle of whiskey and the sea. It's just got a little of everything in that one. Also by Teacroft and Croker. And so he was a very interesting fella, and he had a lot of, obviously, great interest in some of the old fairy and folk tales, but he had also a very distinct voice and was really an excellent writer. And so whatever he wrote tended to endure because he would retell these stories in a way that would make sense to the, quote unquote modern audience. And so he's kind of become a classic in that way. But he has some pretty dark imagery in his work.
Is T. Crofton Croker an American author?
I believe he's Irish.
Irish, okay. And he also has, if the listeners have enjoyed your recaps of his short story, the mermaid short stories, he has a couple appearances in your Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings.
Yes, let's see. Well, he's in the Mermaid book.
Has the Brewery of Eggshells.
2 stories in the Mermaid book. 1 story in the Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings. And I just think he kind of makes an appearance in by mention in the Banshee book, but I don't think I have any of his stories in there. So he may well have written about banshees. He's a really interesting fellow because one of the things that he and his wife both were very interested in was the practice of keening, which is this way of sort of mourning at an Irish funeral and sort of singing in this moany type way, which is very banshee or could be associated with the banshee. And that sometimes people say the banshee cry sounds like Irish keening or somebody at a funeral or with such a sorrowful loss that they can do nothing but wail. And it's that kind of wail that you can't do anything about, and it really rattles you. But he was very interested in that and many aspects of sort of early Irish culture. And, of course, with that comes all of the fairy and folk tales, the mermaids and the changelings and the Pookas and all of that. So I don't know off the top of my head if he ever wrote about banshees, but I would be very surprised if he didn't, because I think the connection with keening probably would have driven him to be very interested in that.
That makes sense. And he just gave us a nice little background on an Irish author. You do include a Japanese author in your Pookas book, Fairies and Pookas book, and her story, The Goblin of Ada Chingahara, is a pretty creepy, another creepy short story. Can you tell us a little bit about that one? I think that's one of your centerpieces for the Pookas book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and very creepy story that is completely one of those. You've probably heard a variation of it at some point in your life, but it's a classic, and yet it's a completely unique story. Mm-hmm. This is a story of a goblin. So I had written about goblins and goblins being sort of a goblin is a loose definition. We often associate goblins with something kind of creepy, maybe a little like ugly and menacing, but there are a number of associations with goblins that are wonderful, like, little hobgoblins that help you out around your house, or things that somebody calls a goblin, but we might actually look at it more like an elf or even a leprechaun. Anyway, in this case, a goblin is something you absolutely do not want to run into. It is something that devours humans. And it is the story of a monk who is walking along a mountain road, all alone, of course, tired and hungry, of course, and it's getting dark, of course. And there's no light to be seen except for the distant light of a cottage just through the woods. Now, there were legends of this sort of goblin in these high mountains, but this monk didn't believe them and was a rather trusting man. So now I'm just retelling this story. This is not verbatim. So the monk is tired, hungry, getting dark, that light is beckoning, and he believes that all people are good. So he enters into the woods and he knocks on the door, and after quite a bit of knocking, a little old lady answers the door, and she says, well, what do you want? I have nothing. And he said, I want nothing. I will just lay on the floor and just, maybe eat a scrap of bread. I just can't be out on another cold night. And so he gets kind of insistent, and after she doesn't necessarily want him to come in right away. So she says, all right, fine, you can come in. I have a little something for you, but I don't have much. And he says, anything is fine. I mean, honestly, a cup of water, and, I'll lay here on the floor. I don't even need a blanket or anything. Well, you can stay here. I'm going to go get firewood to stoke the fire. But I'm telling you one thing right now. Do not look in that door. Do not open that door in the back of the house. Under no circumstances are you allowed to look in that door. And so, okay, thank you so much. I appreciate so much your hospitality. And he's sitting there, and it's getting later and later and later, and time keeps passing, and she's not back yet, and the door is just sort of right there. So of course, what's he gonna do? He's gonna open the door. I mean, this is, he's a monk, but he's still a man. So he
temptation.
Opens the door. He just can't resist the temptation. He opens the door, and to his horror, he sees that it is littered. Human bones of all sizes, femur bones, skulls, finger bones scattered about. And he realizes that this is not a little old lady at all, but this is, in fact, the goblin that he had heard legend of. And he turns around and hightails it out of the house just as she is hunkering back with the wood. And at that point, because she knows that he knows, then she sort of transforms and starts to chase him through the woods. And I'll let you read it to find out if he escapes.
Okay, no, that's
to tell the tale.
It's just interesting how the samples that you present from an international assortment of authors, it just seems like everyone from around the world enjoys ghost stories. It started just sitting around the campfire, being little kids and making the s'mores and eating those, and
right.
it's just fun. It brings back a lot of good memories, and it just the example, the Japanese example, Irish, the Grimm brothers, and it's really just a lot of fun looking at the goblins and hobgoblins and these mermaids. It's just the samples you present in your books are just really well crafted stories from around the globe.
Well, thank you. I really like to find stories that I'm interested in, and I try. Obviously, I can't include great lengthy works because I have a word count that I'm limited to, and I want to get some of my own writing in there too. But I try whenever possible to include at least one or two of my all-time favorite stories, and in its entirety. So, for example, Dracula's Guest, that I have that whole story is in the book. It's not a really long story. And even in the Paranormal Parlor, it, right alongside with Jeff's story about the Parisian catacombs, the haunting in the Parisian catacombs, I had a story that I had been wanting to do something with for a number of years. And I refer to it as a haunting in Paris, but it's this wonderful story that was written by a man named Ralph Adams Cram, who was an architect and really famous for the Gothic revival movement, and had this little secret life writing horror stories, and wrote this story about going into like his friend's aunt's apartment in Paris and discovering this ritual room, and it's just full of all these beautiful, beautiful details, just very, very rich with architectural details. And I read the story, and then I found out who he was, and it made perfect sense that he had been an architect. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because he was so specific about the color of the walls and the style of trim work and all of these things that you wouldn't necessarily think of unless you're really paying attention and the names of these things, you might not think of them. So I just, in finding different stories, I always loved to find things like that were so, just so interesting, to find out what their backstory was, like who is the person behind the story. And that was always part of my criteria in choosing what you put in there. But I like to include things that I like to read, and I thank you for reading them and appreciating them. That means a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's you have some interesting ideas. I do enjoy your books and having you as a guest, and hopefully you'll be back soon. And what we're approaching 20 minutes left, unfortunately. But that means we'll have to do a part 2. But we do need to leave some little bit of time for the audience to learn about Claremont, but to get a couple little things out of the way. Are you working on a new project now, or in between projects? What are you doing at the moment?
I am working on a couple of different projects, but most notably, I've been starting research on something I haven't pitched to my publisher yet, so I probably shouldn't talk too much about it. But I'm working on a book. I think it's going to be pirates. I mean, that's what I'm working on. So I think that would be a nice companion book to the Mermaid book, which is one of the most popular books that I've written, and it's a subject I love. I'm very interested in, and I could definitely see it fitting that format of everything from stories to lore to places, you know, fabulous characters. There's a lot of more obscure pirates that I'd love to bring to light. So that's one of the projects that I'm working on. And then there's a couple of others that I'm not going to jinx myself, so I won't mention them. Won't say them out loud, but a couple other projects that are real dear to my heart. And other than that, I've just got a lot of, I don't know, just normal, everyday stuff. I'm doing interviews about these books and trying to, you know, promote them a bit. Doing a lot of traveling, so that's exciting. Got some trips coming up. One of them is kind of, I'm calling it a research trip. I'm going to take a research trip into, you know, the pirate, you know, kind of the Caribbean. I think I might be able to find some pirate lore down there on my research trip. So.
Okay. Sounds like any day now would be a good time to go get out of this cold, gray, late winter and head down to the Bahamas or Caribbean.
Or just even to, like, California. That would be okay, too. Like, anywhere. Yeah. We'll take anywhere. Absolutely. Actually, I'm traveling next week to San Francisco, and I actually, when I leave, there's supposed to be a huge storm hitting here. So I'm just like, please let my plane take off. Build in a couple extra hours on either end there.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, I hope you get to these destinations soon and, you know, safely, and, you know, report back to us.
Thank you. I will do my best.
But you've also done some international traveling to Ireland to study folklore. How do these trips help you with developing a more insightful approach? Are you talking with, you know, a lot of locals about, you know, if they see mermaids on the rocks, or you know, how are you approaching these research expeditions?
Oh yes, I absolutely talk to the locals as much as possible. Anywhere I go, that is my, you know, number one rule when I travel, is to talk to the locals. And that's, in fact, I've included a few stories in my books over the years, in the Mermaid book and in the Fairy, Pookas, and Changeling book, that were recounted to me. And sometimes it's not like, it's not as if I used to go about the, you know, clipboard and asking people to talk. Many a tale has been told over a pint at the pub, I'll admit. But I think that, you know, some of the most interesting stuff has just kind of come up. Like, I had this wonderful experience where I was in Ireland one time, and I was in Galway, and I was just walking. I was like, I don't know where I'm going, but sometimes you just have to walk and let your feet carry you where, you know, where they want to go. You know, make sure you know how to get back to your hotel or whatever, but just sometimes, you know, you just got to kind of see what will happen. Well, very often when I do this, I end up in a cemetery. This happens to me repeatedly when I travel. Like, you know, we got that my friend Chris and I called it, you know, it's like our spidey sense, our skeleton spidey sense sort of starts twitching, and we just go in that direction, and there's a cemetery. So lo and behold, I'm wandering through this cemetery, and much like in Dracula's Guest, a storm hits, and it's suddenly a torrential Irish downpour. And I take cover in a little sort of open chapel that's in the cemetery because it's pouring rain. I'm equipped for the rain. I have a raincoat and boots and stuff. Well, this is a little stronger than I thought, so I better ride this out. And I was just walking around looking at the graves and stuff. And so I'm kind of hiding out in this little chapel thing, and it's kind of giving me the creeps a little bit. It doesn't have a door or anything. It's just, it's kind of giving me the creeps a little bit. So I decide, forget it. I'm gonna make a dash for it, and I guess I'm just gonna, wander and see if I can find a tea shop or something. And so I kind of dash out of there, and there's a little trailer there, and there's a couple maintenance guys, and cemetery maintenance guys. And they throw up in the trailer, and they beckon to me. They go, what are you doing? They're so crazy. So they come inside, and they make me a cup of tea. And the first thing that he says to me is, he says, I can see you like cemeteries. And I said, yes. And he said, but why were you hiding in the Protestant side? I was like, why were you? Because the cemetery was actually, there was a road in between, and one side was Protestant, one side was Catholic, and I had inadvertently dashed into the Protestant chapel to take cover. I was, what are you doing in the Protestant side? So I started laughing, and then he said, well, if you like cemeteries, I'm going to tell you where there's some pirates buried. And he gave me these very descriptive directions that had no road names, nothing specific like that. It was, you're going to walk, and you're going to turn out here, and you're going to walk and walk and walk, and you're going to walk down until you go under an overpass. And you'll know you're going the right way if you keep the C on your left. Always keep the C on your left. And keep walking, and you'll find, this broken down sort of wall. And just beyond that wall, you'll find a cemetery. And sure enough, I listened to this man, and he told me about this cemetery. And I followed his directions, always keeping the C on my left. And I found this graveyard that was so overgrown. It was almost like under kind of like a freeway overpass, but it wasn't quite. It was sort of just at the base of like a road, very neglected. And there were graves in there from the 1600s, and he said some of them were pirate graves. And so and I wrote this all down in great details, 20 years ago when he had told me the story. But that was probably the greatest example to me of what happens when you travel and you listen to what people have to say. You will find, that wasn't in any guidebook. That wasn't even on any blog about cemeteries. That is, and could I find it again? Maybe, if I followed his directions to the letter. But it was just such a cool thing. And I learned that in Ireland, everyone's a wonderful storyteller. You get that entire history of Ireland's 32 from your cab driver. So you have to listen. You have to go there and be a good listener, because you will learn things that aren't in the history books for sure, and aren't in the, collections of William Butler Yeats folklore and such. So.
Okay. That's a nice, hopefully an inspirational story for people might be doing some traveling over the summer. We have roughly 10 minutes left, and we need to quickly captivate the audience with Claremont. I think that's about the centerpiece of your vampires and werewolves book. It's really it's not really it's a long short story, but it's really like a lost classic. It's really a fantastic novella.
Yes, and that is a story that I included in its entirety and actually threw a few things out of the manuscript in order to be able to keep it because I couldn't figure out how to just excerpt from it. It's one of the best stories I've ever read and one of the first vampire stories ever written, and certainly, beautifully written and incredibly haunting. And kind of shocking and riling for the time.
Right.
It involves a priest who, at the very moment in which he is about to take his final vows and profess the rest of his life and labors to God, at that moment, the church door opens, and in comes Clarimond, a rather unearthly creature who continues to sort of test the priest's ability to be priestly just by her natural feminine charms. And it's got this really creepy twist, which I hate to give it away, but there's a very, very, very dark ending to this story, and it's kind of shocking, and especially when you think of it being, today that wouldn't be so shocking if somebody wrote about this, but because this was written so long ago, you think, well, how did that even get published? It's just completely crazy for the times and that sort of 1830s Parisian sensibility, although I imagine that was also pretty raucous in its own way. But it definitely there are a lot of other undertones to it that could easily be debated as being commentary on the state of the church at the time, I think, for sure. But at its core, it's really just a beautiful and incredibly dark love story about, a priest, what he believes, and this woman who seems to have fallen ill and seems to take the priest by some kind of spell. And kind of the whole story is just full of, it's a very tense story. I don't know if you felt that when you were reading it, but I always feel so tense when I'm reading that story because there's so much tension just in, his constant resistance to the enchantments of Clarimond. And it's really, I can't emphasize enough how dark it gets. It's really quite wonderful, but it's a bit shocking.
Yeah, I agree with you. It really is a excellent example of vampiric literature. It's worth getting Banshees, Werewolves and Vampires alone just to get that. But you have so many other excellent stories in those books, but really Claremont stands out as a premier example of vampires in literature. I'm just really glad you were able to keep the entire work as it was written in there. Okay.
Yeah, you have to read it from beginning to end because I actually hadn't heard of it before I read it, and when I read it, I was shocked. And I read it again and again and again to make sure that what I thought had happened had actually happened. And I don't want to give it away because it's really dark. So we'll just ruin it.
we don't have to discuss the ending, but I think I'm sure you put the hooks into, the listeners with, your the setup of the story. Hey, we're about 5 minutes from the end. Do you want to plug any of your websites and last minute things, and just give you plenty of time to talk about where to find your books, and do you have any upcoming appearances?
Yes, thank you. My website is varlaventura.net. Not .com, .net. I let the .com lapse, and then somebody tried to get me to pay $5,000 for it or something. So now we're .net. In case you're wondering. So some of the old books have the wrong, but you just search my name, Varla Ventura, and it appears on it pops right up. I keep on my website, I keep a running tally of upcoming radio appearances and any public appearances or book signings, which I don't do a lot of those, but if they ever come up, they're on there. And then, of course, on my Facebook page, I keep that pretty up to date with links for shows, especially right before they go live. But mostly, I have some radio. I'd have to check the schedule. But I have a few things coming up through March, and then I'm already starting to book in October, if you can believe that already. The high holy season for for magic.
Better grab her quick, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to have you come back for a Halloween show.
Definitely.
And people might be able to have you autograph a book on the beach soon.
Oh yeah, that's I always regretted not doing themed book signings location based. So, for example, signing the Mermaid book on a white sand beach would be lovely. But actually, I just pulled my thing up. So what do I have? I know that I'm Barbara, right, Barbara? We've got a date coming up. Mm-hmm. And then I think I've got a couple of shows I'm recording that are podcasts that will be released in March. And then, other than that, I don't have too much thus far. You never know. Sometimes someone just calls you and you're free. So.
Okay. And people can get your books from your publisher.
You can buy. They're available on Amazon. I believe you can get them all Barnes and Noble, IndieBound if you want to shop online, but go the independent bookstore route. And I do have all of those links on my website. And then actual bookstores, if you're willing to wait, you can get them to order them, and they're all in print, so you could probably even get your library to stock them. And so everything's available. And really, if you just go on, something like Amazon, just type in Varla Ventura, you'll see a bunch of books come up. I also have a pretty big collection of sort of one-off short Kindle-only, ebooks that are some of these short stories with introductions. But the print books are all on there as well. And the most recent one is called Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor. And that's kind of the one that just came out in June of 2018. So we're just not even quite done with pushing that one around.
Hey, Mark, you got to start saying good night. You got 15 seconds.
Thank you, Barbara.